A question came to mind when you talked about Paul, when he said, "Beware of the dogs." And why did he circumcise Timothy? It always confused me because this is what he was preaching effectively.
Yeah. Well, Paul has been criticized for Timothy being circumcised. I mean, there have been critics aplenty. There have been people who said on the surface of it that was unwise. He should not have made that concession. I mean, there's people reading the book of Acts. And let me say this, Paul was not, I believe his letters are inerrant. I don't know that everything Paul did was inerrant. His fight with Barnabas wasn't. I don't think you could say, man, that sure glorified God that they got in a big fight and split up. I doubt it. You know, the circumcision of Timothy was an accommodation to what we might call a Jewish spice. There was, at the court of the Gentiles of the temple, a sign that said any Gentile who went beyond the court of the Gentiles would be executed. It'd be like being found today trying to get close to the Kaaba in the midst of Islamic people, and you're not an Islamic person. There was that sign. In fact, it's been found by archaeologists. If you went past that sign as a Gentile, you were subject to execution. It might have been more than principle than practice, but it was there.
So it could be a form of appeasing.
No, it was without any question. It was to appease him and maybe to keep Timothy from being executed as a Greek. But you're right. Here was this man who called the Judaizers. They dogged his steps. I mean, in Galatians, he just got right down ugly about it in the most visceral language that he ever used, talking about the Judaizers. And yet, here he circumcises Timothy. Oftentimes, Pauline scholars will say this is an example of his willingness to become all things to all men. You know, I belong to the school of thought. I don't know that it was Paul's best moment to do that. You know, you can't say everything Paul did was inerrant. If that makes any sense. You know, could it have been accommodated? It's raised a problem in Pauline studies always, and the only positive construction is it was an evidence of becoming all things to all people, and maybe not to put his good friend and son and mentee in danger when Paul knew his every step was being dogged, he's being spied on. Yes, please. We need a microphone. Okay.
I just wondered how you would unpack, like, the Song of Solomon to Joe's six-pack. How would you unpack, like, the Song of Solomon, the Book of Solomon?
The Song of Solomon?
Yeah, to Joe's six-pack.
Carefully.
Well, I guess what I meant was what kind of imagery would be appropriate?
Yeah.
What
Well,
would you use?
it's interesting you would raise that, the Song of Solomon, because in the history of preaching, in Christian preaching, it has almost always been allegorized. I mean, the great Spurgeon, if you read his devotionals morning and evening, you read it anywhere he touches the Song of Solomon, he allegorizes it as an allegory of Christ and his bride, the church. Now, there's an old saying in Texas, you can hit some good licks with crooked sticks. That's not the intention of the Song of Solomon in Hebrew literature. The original intention is a love poem. It's a celebration of love between a man and a woman. That's the intention of it, the goodness of it. Now, early on, the church started to allegorize that. I talked last night about allegory. And that is to arbitrarily assign a meaning. This is that. And everyone from Augustine of Hippo Regius in North Africa to Charles Spurgeon to others have allegorized it as an allegory between Christ and his church. Now, I don't mind that if you just say, I'm using this as an illustration. That was not the original authorial intent. And if you're honest to the text, you're trying to find what was the intent of the author. All biblical studies needs to be driven. What was the original authorial intent? Now, let me give you a counterpoint example. In Hebrews 4, where Paul talks about Christ as our great high priest who has passed through the heavens, there he is attributing an intent to the Levitical priesthood, that it is a paradigm, a schematic, a blueprint of something that was yet to come. Just as the high priest walked through the courts of the temple into the Holy of Holies, Christ is ascended through the heavens. Now, there he says there was an intent in inspired Holy Scripture. He's attributing intent. It's very difficult in the New Testament to find an intent attributed to the Song of Solomon that the allegorists use. But you're using it as an extended illustration. And what I mean when I say you're hitting some good licks with a crooked stick, you're using a text to tell the truth. Christ does love his church like a bridegroom a bride. You're using it as an extended illustration. But I think you need to acknowledge in honesty and clarity that that was not the intent of the original author of the Song of Solomon. Mm-hmm.
So then would you unpack it as the way a husband should treat his wife?
Yeah, that would be closer to it. The love between a husband and a wife would be much closer to the author's intent. If you want to use it as an allegory, just say, this is a good illustration. Mm-hmm. If you want the interesting, let me give you a book, Stanley Gradanus, Preaching Christ from the Old Testament. I don't have time to go into that, but if you want a solid, it's meat, it's not milk. It's very well done. Gradanus, Preaching Christ from the Old Testament. How are you appropriately to use the Old Testament to preach Christ? I'm a firm believer that you should use the Old Testament to preach Christ, but you need to use it in the way he used it. Right there next to the favorite verse in the New Testament, John 3:16. God so loved the world. You know what's right next to that? A snake. A snake. A snake. Jesus put a snake right next to that verse. Even as the serpent was what? Lifted up. Now there he put his hand on Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament. I have every warrant to go back and to preach that passage when the carpet vipers were killing the Israelites and they looked at a brass snake. He put that right next to John 3:16. I have a warrant to use Hebrew Scripture in a way he said it could be used. Does that make sense? Stanley Gradanus, yes.
Well, I just got a question on the example of emptying oneself. So Jesus emptied himself, but then you said that at the very core of Christ was the form of God, was God himself.
Yeah.
So was it a requirement? And could you just unpack that a little bit more, that word empty? Because I guess the thing is the Greek word kenoa.
Yeah.
So does he empty himself of God, empty himself of everything in order to be exalted? What's the process involved?
Yeah, well, this was, of course, one of the things that was wrestled with even in the church councils, the ancient church creeds. The Apostles' Creed didn't exactly address it. Nicaea didn't exactly address it. Chalcedon addressed it. He said every piece of him was, so he says, very God of very God, without mixture and without confusion and without division. The Chalcedonian Creed, and what it meant was, it wasn't that he had like the Nestorian said, he had a divine mind and a human body. No. Ever blood, ever sinew, ever corpuscle was very God of very God, very man. So you have to avoid anti-creedalism. And I have no problem in, the church adopted those creeds as a matter of providence to define the Christian faith. So he wasn't ever less than. And there, I don't think we have to explain the unexplainable. There is an element in proclamation that has to be left in sheer mystery. How is it that it could be that he sat down weary at a well side while he himself was sustaining all creation? And that is an element of sheer mystery. And I think in that regard, when we say emptied himself, we can't press beyond the language, the image, and try to become so parsing of it that we push it all the way to extreme. It fades out into a mystery. You know, on the one hand, it says he knew man and what was in man. He knew what people were going to say before they said it. There's elements of deity, and yet John, the gospel that most emphasizes his deity, at the same time, most emphasizes his humanity. There he is at Lazarus' tomb. He's not crying in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but there the Word made flesh weeps outside the tomb of his friend and sits weary on a well side. So I think you can lead people up to the edge of mystery, but you can't ultimately define the mystery.
Sure.
You know, it would almost be like J.B. Phillips' great book, Your God is Too Small. So preachers do need to be willing to say.
We could at least say that he emptied himself of his human desires, couldn't we? So his human characteristics and his human desires, everything human about him, he emptied himself.
He emptied himself to become.
But we don't know if he emptied himself fully as good in that sense, because that's a mystery. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would say creedalism, if you say believe in the Chalcedonian Creed, he didn't empty himself of his deity. They went into great detail to say in his incarnation, he was God and man without division, without confusion. And they were trying to say indivisible, to push back against one of the early church heresies that he had a divine mind and a human body. And they wanted to push that to say, no. Very God of very God, at the same time, man. And it bleeds off into a mystery that I can't explain. It's without analogy. Yeah.
Sure. It's just that context that you said, because you said he was super exalted.
Yeah.
So when he emptied himself, he was super exalted. So that's a kind of a process, isn't it, that we all go through. Yeah. But I was just trying to get more clarity on that.
And I think, too, you have to, in that, if I were to expand on that, the pre-incarnate Christ was not an incarnate, embodied human being. But the ascended Christ is an incarnate, embodied, glorified human being. And that is, he became something that he had never been before. I mean, the ascended Christ in classical Christology, the ascended Christ is an incarnate, glorified human being. So much so that 1 John says when we see him, you know, we'll see him as he is, will be made to be like him. So when I say super exalted, in a sense, he went back with more than he ever had.
Sure.
Now you're dancing on the edge of total mystery. And I have to leave, I put personally in my preaching, I have to leave some of that.
Sure, yeah.
You lose the trail. And also, all human language talking about God is accommodation. John Calvin used he was talking about Scripture. This is John Calvin, the first Protestant exegete. John Calvin said, you hear a mother talking baby talk to her baby. Calvin said, you know, how mothers will talk to a baby, me, moo, 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 you know, baby talk. John Calvin said that is what Scripture is. He says it's God talking baby talk to mere human beings. That's what John said, John Calvin.